I often think of dictatorial regimes as essentially similar to mafia families. And there's always rivalry. There's always someone jockeying for position. And it's a contest of brutality and who has the most power over other people and intimidating them. But now, since the fall of the regime, Assad has found a refuge in Russia under Putin's protection. And that should be an astonishing fact for anyone today.
Whatever regime comes in, it should be a non-starter that part of its policy and activities will be to arm and support the fighters against Israel and more broadly against the West.
The murderous dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad in Syria collapsed last week to the surprise of many people. Assad ran away and found refuge in Russia. After 13 years of a kind of civil war, many Syrians are celebrating. But who will now govern the country? A jihadist group known by its initials, HTS. Should Assad's fall have come as a surprise? What are America's interests in the situation? What is the philosophic significance of the new Syria? Welcome to the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. I'm Elan, Journo. I'm joined today by my colleague, Onkar Ghate. Onkar, let me start by asking you, were you surprised? Do you think anyone should have been surprised by the collapse of the Assad regime?
I was surprised with the rapidity of it, of how quickly they moved from town to town and Assad fled. On the other hand, I think what we've seen in the past and in recent history is how precarious such regimes are. And I mean, the stories in the aftermath are the soldiers really didn't fight. They sort of ran away against the opposition. And that they're demoralized. They're not sort of anywhere close to enthusiastic followers of the regime. And you saw that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, a similar thing, that the whole apparatus, nobody really believes in what they're doing. It's at the top, they're holding power for power's sake. And when one thinks of it like that, it's inherently precarious. And from that perspective, I don't think it's surprising that when the first few dominoes go, it's a rapid process for the whole thing to fall.
One of the points about the precariousness of authoritarian and dictatorial regimes, which I think this is true of Syria, and I think it's definitely true of others that I've looked at, they hollow out society. It's not as if society is organizations and different constituencies. It's just a ruling family or a ruler, and then cronies and people who are of varying degrees of loyalty. And the kinds of dynamics that occur in those political regimes is when you have people who are elevated because they're brutal and they're able to suppress opponents, then you get a kind of rising to the top, the most unsavory kinds of people, and who themselves harbor their own ambitions. So there's the constant pull and tug of who's got a back a knife ready to go into your back. And I think there's always that kind of uncertainty with a regime like this. And it's not surprising that you would get Assad fleeing the minute it looks as if his regime is over. There's really no society there to hold it together. It's like, I often think of dictatorial regimes as essentially similar to mafia families. And there's always rivalry. There's always someone jockeying for position. And it's a contest of brutality and who has the most power over other people and intimidating them. So in that sense, it's not something you can count on being standing on its own for any prolonged period of time, unless it's sustained by more and more brutality against the people who would push it away. So let's turn to some of the implications of what's happening both in the Middle East and beyond that. So how do you think of this as changing the dynamics in the Middle East? Well, a lot of people are talking about this as a severe blow to Iran, because Iran was an ally of Assad. It was using Syria as a place to transport weapons to its allies in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and to Hamas, and stationing military installations. How do you think of what's happening right now?
Iran certainly seems like it's in a weaker position. But I want to talk first about the wider implications of that authoritarian regimes like this are less powerful and more precarious than they seem. Because I think one of the lessons is the tragedy of 9/11 and our response to it. There's a way which you could think about the response as we picked weak targets. We picked Afghanistan, an incredibly backward country, and we picked that because Osama bin Laden was hiding there. And if we didn't do something in regard to that, what can you actually say you're doing as a response and retribution for 9/11? But then it was Iraq and not Iran, even though at the time and for decades prior, Iran is the center of the terrorist funding the terrorism and put it against the U.S. It was clearly the number one enemy. And we didn't target Iran. And I think the best of bad spins you can put on why is, well, Iran's a more powerful regime. Iraq's an easier target. We saw that in the Gulf War. We can go and finish the job. And everybody knows that Saddam Hussein is a brute. So we'll face less world outrage that we're doing something in response to 9/11. There's a whole host of it. But part of it, I think, was Iran is a much tougher opponent. Even though Iraq fought a war to a stalemate, so there isn't reason to think of a regime like the Iranian regime as, well, that's powerful. That's a different a different ball game if we were to attack and try to dispose of Iran. And I think part of what we see, and with the weakness of Iran today and the blows it's suffered, is there wasn't ever reason to think that it's a much more formidable opponent. And in that sense, if after 9/11 our target had been Iran and not Iraq, the Middle East would be radically different from what it is today. And so this illusion of the power of authoritarian regimes has dramatically bad consequences if your foreign policy is partly premised on thinking of authoritarian regimes like that today. But I'm interested then, like, where you think Iran's position is today with some of its proxies certainly wounded, at least.
Yeah, so just to sum up some of what you're bringing up, it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is one of Iran's original proxies in line with advancing its Islamist goals in the region since decades ago, has been severely degraded, maybe really decapitated, having lost its leader a few months ago under Israeli retaliation. And Hamas has been severely degraded. I don't know that they've been defeated yet. They don't sound like they've been defeated, but they're severely weakened. And then I think there's the elimination of the Assad regime creates a new opening for a different kind of country in Syria. But definitely the people moving in are not disposed to be friendly to Iran, at least at this point. So I think that in those with those three changes, what Iran used to be famous for is this crescent of influence that it was trying to build in the Middle East. And I think that's much weaker than it was months ago, which is a good thing. I mean, it's important to say, there's a lot to say about what Syria is going to look like and some concerns, significant concerns about that. But it's a good thing that Iran has been weakened and its ability to inflict its ideas and attack people through the region has been really impacted in the last month or so as a result of this. So I raised this as a question. So you took us to the weakness of these authoritarian regimes and the kind of fantasy that led us to the kind of targeting of weaker countries after 9/11. Let's turn then to some of the implications right now. We've talked about Iran being weakened, which is a positive. Any other things that you're thinking about that are important to trace out as implications?
Well, one of it is to be realistic about what might emerge in Syria. So, yeah, I simultaneously had, when you see a dictator fall, a brutal dictator, it's it's something good to see. And so in that sense, you can think it's not a celebration exactly, but it's a relief that it's a dictator has fallen. But when you look at what the opposition is and what they hold and what they believe, will you get something that is somewhat better than what the Assad regime, and I mean, holding power for 40 plus years, that you can't have fantasies about that. And I mean, we talked about this in regard to the Arab Spring in that's 2010, 2011. There was a real delusion of thinking. So both that I think about the population at large, that they're pro-freedom. They're against their oppression, and they were against the dictators through the Middle East, or at least the particular dictators oppressing them now. And anybody in that kind of situation can rebel against brutal leaders and think, I want something different. That's not the same as being on the side of freedom. And it's the same now here in terms of, I mean, the Civil War really started as a result of trying to squash protests of the Arab Spring. And you can't just be delusional about what that opposition is and what they're after. And so that's, I mean, in terms of thinking of the next steps, it's really important to think about that with clear eyes, not fantasies.
Yeah, I want to go back to the Arab Spring. So for some people might not remember it that well. As you said, it started 2010, 2011, and it occurred in a number of countries. There was a number of incidents, one in Tunisia, another major protests in Egypt, and then, as you mentioned, in Syria, and then a number of other places. But these are the high points in the sense that they got the most coverage and they were a kind of trigger for many people. So what happened in Egypt and in Syria and in other places, I think is important, because we commented on this when it was happening, and I think our analysis was proven out. The way I think of this is that I think it's right to think of it as a fantasy. Part of the fantasy was people in that part of the world have better ideas than they actually do. So you put it as, yes, they oppose the particular dictators they have right now, and maybe they want other leaders, and there's a positive about that, but it's not the same thing as wanting and understanding what a free society is, or being ready to build a society like that. I think Egypt is the bellwether in this respect, because what happened in Egypt was really the crucible of the Arab Spring. So Egypt had mass demonstrations, maybe the largest it's ever had, in a famous square in Cairo, where people chanted for the removal of the military dictator. And eventually he stepped down after many, many protests. And this was seen as a watershed moment. And as you said, when a dictator leaves, it's a good thing. The question then is, in favor of what, and who's going to replace him? And here you get some of where the fantasy comes in, and the self-delusion in some cases, which was the most potent force in Egypt at that time was the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the one of the sort of the grandfather of the Islamist movement across the Middle East, at least in many countries outside of Iran. And they played the political system. They ran candidates and they won by significant margins. And one of their own became, I think it was prime minister or president, I forget exactly the position he held, until he was removed by the military. So there was a snapping back to the military, correcting and bringing back one of their own and installing him as a dictator eventually. But the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood had such success and rallied so many people into the streets was a powerful signal of what ideas people gravitate to. And that doesn't mean everyone in the streets, everyone in the square protesting wanted an Islamist regime to take over, but many of them did. And I think enough of them did that it led to the success, at least for a while, of the Muslim Brotherhood candidate in Cairo. And then what you see in Syria is, as you said, the civil war, which might not be the best term for it, but it was essentially within confines of Syria's border. It was the suppression of graffiti telling Assad it's time for him to step down. This was a part of the groundswell. And the repression against that led to fighting. But who was fighting Assad? So Assad is a not particularly ideological dictator, but he was faced with Islamists, jihadists, like the groups that became the Islamic State and the group that is now in power, or asserting its power in Syria, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the Organization for the Liberation of al-Sham, or the Levant, which is, and their goal is the same as the Islamic State goal, which is an Islamic regime in Syria. We'll come back to that in a moment, but that's an important piece of what one has to think about in the Syrian civil war. Now, that's my account, and I think that's borne out by the facts of what ideas dominate in the region, what are the kind of political dynamics you can expect. But that's not the way this was understood. And the way I would characterize the analysis that you could have seen at the beginning of the Arab Spring, even when it was starting to point in the direction of the Islamists gaining more power, it was an analysis that drained out or was anti-ideological. It was not concerned with thinking about the ideas. So it was almost as if when you think of the jihadists, it's, well, they're another political party and they happen to have ideas that would lead them to an Islamic totalitarian regime, but they're just another political party, as if they're just cut out of a different part of the cloth as any other political party here in any Western country. So you saw that in the Arab Spring. It was a self-delusion about what are the major ideological forces in the region. And they're not new. They've been there for decades. And that's part of why I think of it as self-delusion. Now you see it cropping up again with the movement, as it calls itself, the Organization to Liberate the Levant, which is HTS, the Islamists who are now asserting control over Syria. It's notable when you read accounts of this is it's a very subordinate point that you discover, and they actually used to be part of Al-Qaeda. They used to be, some of them were in the Islamic State when it was a power in Syria and Iraq. And it's a detail. It's, and there's concerns. Are they still going to be so-called conservative about their religious views? Or are they going to be pluralistic? And as if this is a question that can be entertained in the same way as, well, would the Democratic candidate move to the center in the same way that we think of political candidates here in the US, navigating a political spectrum and ignoring what is a highly differentiated, religiously rooted ideology that animates these people. And it's why they commit atrocities when they are in power. So there's a kind of, you can call it an anti-ideological or ideas blind approach to understanding the region. And the Arab Spring was one major point. I think the current analysis of what's going on in Syria is another example of that. And I think that the less attention you pay to the ideas animating groups, the less you can possibly understand about what the future holds and what some of the risks are. And I think that's the pattern we've seen for a long time, not just the Arab Spring, but even going back to the post 9/11 period.
Yeah, and it's worth talking to some. I've been talking about some more of the reactions to what's happened in Syria. As you said, to reinforce your point about that, we still, and our media still cannot think in ideological terms. When it's reported about, they had a connection to Al-Qaeda, they're on our terrorist watch list, or terrorist list. There's very little discussion. Like, why are they on that list? What are they after? It's like, well, if they sever a connection to Al-Qaeda, another terrorist organization, then, okay, that makes them, that you can deal with them. And there's very little about what are their long-term goals, what animates them. Like, terrorism is a tactic. It's not what's animating them. And the whole coverage of the fall of the regime, I found, both just interesting to tell you something about the state of the media, but also revealing about that state. So after the fall, there's been a fair amount of coverage, at least of what I watch a lot of, or listen and watch to a lot of NPR, of stories about the brutality of the regimes, of going through some of the prisons, but they're not real prisons. They're to put opponents of the regime and so on, to lock them up, to terrorize them, and to kill them. So there's been reporting on the brutality of the regime, but not anything that has a wider integrative perspective. They're not trying to connect the dots and integrate. So they'll simultaneously be on the side, like we should be doing deals with Iran. There's a nuclear deal. And Iran was one of the backers of the Syrian regime, which means it's one of the backers of this level of brutality, of killing, of torture. And yet, we've got victims now, and it seems like real victims. So we're going to report about how bad the regime was and what they did without any wider implications of the meaning of that, of who their support came from, how we should think about that, and so how one should think more widely about the region. It's just a focus on victims without any wider thought, which is, it's not surprising, but it is outrageous if you're actually concerned with, like, where will the Middle East be in 10, 15, 20 years?
Yeah, I want to add to what you're saying regarding the kind of concrete focus on, they used to be connected to Al-Qaeda and they renounced Al-Qaeda. They used to be part of Islamic State, and I thought of this as a textbook example of what Ayn Rand talks about with people who are concrete bound. A minute detail carries significance that it doesn't really carry in reality, but in their mind it does. And it's partly because it's a convenient thing to focus on, and partly because they're so unwilling to think more abstractly, to integrate, as you were putting it, like thinking more broadly, and what are the pieces, how do you fit them together, and where do they lead? And there's a way in which the focus on, well, are they part of Al-Qaeda? Are they not part of Al-Qaeda? That's such a trivial detail to me, because Al-Qaeda is just a bunch of splintered cells that they think of themselves as, yeah, we're on one umbrella, but they hate each other some of the time. They like each other some of the time. It's not even true to what the reality of it is. And the focus on that is a way of not having to deal with the deeper issue here, which is, what do they actually stand for, and what difference would it make if they invented a new organization and called themselves that? So that's one thing that outraged me when I saw this as part of the analysis, and it's coming up because now they're seeking out Western recognition. They want to be seen as the official government of Syria. And for that to happen, they have to be removed from these terrorist lists. And as you put it, that no one's really thinking, why were they ever on these lists, and what would it mean to be removed? And are these lists well organized and well defined? And the other aspect of this that you mentioned, which I also found really astonishing, is this the non-integrative or compartmentalized view of what's happening. So you pointed out the way in which, if you're concerned about the victims of Assad's regime and the people who are being brought out of these dungeons and the families that have been broken and the people whose lives have been destroyed because of what this regime has done to them over decades, why aren't you also outraged at Syria, at Syria's other allies, such as Putin in Russia, who has been a major force, not only propping up Assad for many years, fighting this on his behalf in different parts of the country, but now, since the fall of the regime, Assad has found a refuge in Russia under Putin's protection. And that should be an astonishing fact for anyone today, because there's another podcast to be done about the way views of Russia and Putin in particular have changed over time. And I think one force that's been pushing against a rational assessment of Putin are various factions within the American conservative movement, the sort of so-called new right or reactionary right. I'm not sure what the best term for it might be, but the kind of people who would have a 3-hour interview with Putin, like Tucker Carlson, and pretend to be journalists and in fact whitewash what he does, or they would present him as a leader that everyone should admire. And that's many people now on that side of the spectrum. To me, that is, if Iran is an accomplice to the crimes or an accessory to the crimes of the Assad regime, which it is, and if it's an accomplice and accessory to the enabling of Hamas and other Islamist groups, it is. All of those things are true of Iran, and many other worse things are true of Iran. All of those are also true, and even many times more for Russia. And you think about Russia providing military and actual people on the ground fighting on behalf to support the Assad regime. That should be such a damning verdict on Russia, but it isn't. And that is a commentary on the way people think or don't think properly about the Middle East, and they don't think properly about Russia in particular. So to me, part of the fall of Assad in Syria is a moment to reflect about all the people who were there holding his hand and putting weapons in it and putting the torture devices in his hand and money and all of that. They're at least as guilty, if not more, because they knew it and they continued and enabled it to happen. So if you're really concerned about that, those are some of the regimes you should also be outraged at, not simply the Assad regime, as evil as it is.
And the other aspect of this that has really stood out to me is, so while simultaneously they report a little bit about, well, Syria, the arming of Hamas and Hezbollah was partly through Syria. Iran was working in Syria to prop up both the Syrian regime, but also these other proxies, all as opponents of Israel. And they will now, with the fall of Assad's regime in Syria, they will point, this is a brutal dictatorship. Nobody was free. Everybody lived in fear of it. And they can't make the one step to, well, but this is what Hamas aspires to be, what, insofar as they've got power in the Gaza Strip and so on, this is exactly what they've done, and driven the opponents out, including killing them, and terrorizing the population. They wish they could gain more power and have the level of power that Assad's regime had. And because here you can just focus on the victims without saying anything about Israel and anything good about, and that in comparison, it's light years towards civilization versus these kinds of places and these kinds of regimes. Whatever criticisms, and there are criticisms to make of Israel's government and so on, they're criticism in the context of it's essentially a free country. Here, the criticisms of these regimes is they're brutal dictatorships. And that's true of Hamas. And they can cover it now in regard to Syria and so on. They can't do it in regard to Hamas. How little you get about what Hamas and power in the Gaza Strip look like, even while now you've got a war going on. It really is astonishing in regard to the Western press. And that's because here you've got hapless victims that you can parade into. And Israel doesn't look like a victim in the same way. And so you can't have the same view, which you should. They're essentially the same. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Syrian regime.
One way to think about the Assad regime is that it is something that others have aspired to, and they would build regimes as bad, if not worse, as it did. I think it's worth just concretizing for a moment for people what the Assad regime was. And as you said, there's a lot more coverage coming out right now about the people who were put through the grinder of the Assad regime and all the torture and the horrific attacks, including chemical weapons. But I think it's worth just zooming out for a moment to say what Assad's regime was trying to do, Iran is following in its footsteps. So in 2007, the Assad regime was building a nuclear reactor, which by all indications was for weapons use, not for nuclear energy. And it was destroyed by an Israeli airstrike. The plans for this nuclear reactor were, as far as I can tell, they were basically photocopied from North Korea with North Korean help. And we know North Korea has weapons that are nuclear powered. Now, that is a good thing that was destroyed. But imagine if Syria had developed nuclear weapons 15 years ago. Imagine not only its use of chemical weapons against people, but nuclear weapons. That is not out of the question. So it's a regime that was actively pursuing nuclear weapons, in addition to all the torture that you've heard about, in addition to all of the crimes and the police state control. I mean, the people in Syria are talking about there's a little policeman inside all of us because the walls have ears and you don't know who's listening and who's going to inform on you and who was going to extract a confession from you under duress to meet some quota or just because you said the wrong thing. So if you combine the Iranian desire for power and mass destruction weapons such as nuclear capability, if you combine East Germany's police state, and then on top of that, you have to know Syria's long history of supporting both Palestinian Islamist groups and other terrorist groups and Lebanese terrorist groups such as Hezbollah, and its occupation of Lebanon and its influence over Lebanon's government, its assassination of the Lebanese prime minister many years ago, its attempts to control other countries. This is the Iranian playbook, and it was enacted by a leader who wasn't a theocrat, but he was a dictator, and he wanted some of the same things and dominating people. So it's important to know the character of this regime, but it's important also to see that it is not unique in those respects. It is a model for some, and it is something that others are doing right now. So Iran is actively building nuclear capabilities. To believe that that's anything other than a menacing and weapons-intended purpose is to lie to yourself. And it's important to just understand that Assad may not have been in the headlines, but it was an evil regime, and that the full extent of that needs to be really, if only that really sunk in. And as you're suggesting, I think this is the important next step, is to see that it is a model for others, and that something that more Hamas and Hezbollah, this is exactly what they would like to do at a scale at least as big, and if not bigger. So these are the forces of barbarism. Assad is famously, he was trained as an ophthalmologist, I believe, and his wife was educated in the UK. So they seemed much more palatable. They dressed in suits. They didn't seem like the finger-waving ayatollahs of Iran. But their aims and their practices are essentially the same, and their evil is the same, at least as bad, if not worse. And that's part of what's not understood. And I have a great deal of sympathy for the people, incredible suffering in Syria. But as you were pointing out, there's a skew in the reporting on this, and I think it's reflective of a moral perspective. So you put it as there's hapless victims, but that's a manifestation of a particular philosophic assumption that's unstated. But I think it's important to name it. How would you sort of flesh that out, Onkar?
That this is part of what altruism as a moral doctrine teaches people, how to look at the world. So I put it as hapless victims. It means people who are unable or unwilling to help themselves. Our whole moral concern has to be towards them and alleviating their needs and their suffering. So the whole focus is on suffering. And so when you have something like October 7th, and Israel was a clear victim, and there's immediate suffering, and there was immediate sympathy towards Israel. Okay, this is bad. I mean, leave aside there was a small minority celebrating the attacks on Israel, but in the sort of press and the reporting on it, there was some sympathy for Israel, when you can just paint it as, look at the victim and look at the massacre and look at the people killed. But when Israel then pushes back and said, we're not going to have another October 7th, we've made some fatal mistakes, or worse than mistakes, and I think it likely is, there was real evasion going on of the threats that they faced. But we're going to reverse course and we're going to end the threat of Hamas. Then you can't just paint them as, well, these are suffering people who we have to minister to. These are now people who are standing up for themselves and are going to try to defend themselves. And then they have a totally different moral status. They no longer are the concern of morality. And indeed, but this is self-assertion, it's self-defense, it's selfish. They're standing up for themselves, and they become now not the objects of sympathy and of moral concern, but now of objects of moral outrage. Now what we have to do is attack and denounce Israel for standing up for itself and for exerting its right to self-defense. And you can say, like, it's a long-term self-defense if they're really trying to end Hamas as a threat. And then it will be, well, but that's not proportional. And what gives you the right to do that and to assert yourself? And that is the morality that is ingrained in people's minds because it's taught over and over and over in school, in church, in the media, everywhere you look. This is taken as, well, but everybody knows this. This is just what morality means. And it's a morality that worships suffering. And you can see that here playing out in the Middle East. And you see it with the student protesters. That if you get protesters after October 7th against Israel, and you don't get protests, what we didn't get on U.S. campuses, against the Syrian regime and what they're doing in the Middle East to Arabs and to people who are powerless, it tells you their concern is not really with the evil of dictatorship, of depriving people of freedom. And so their concern is very different. It's for anybody who will stand up for themselves, which is what Israel did in the aftermath of October 7th. And that's what outrages them. And that's what they've been taught to be outraged by.
Maybe we should start to pull some of these threads together and talk about what might be on the horizon in the new Syria and what would you want to see. So, and within the range of what's reasonable to expect. So this group, HTS, isn't a jihadist group. It does have the goal of ruling people under Islamic religious law. It remains to be seen what that looks like and how successful they'll be and how much of Syria they'll actually be able to control if Syria once again descends into some sort of anarchic war. But assuming that they do take over, what do you think is reasonable to expect and should be an American interest here, if any, in this context?
Yeah, I think of it, and we talked about this at length after 9/11, that you can't have the fantasy that, say, George W. Bush had. We're going to transform the Middle East. Everybody, apart from the leaders, really are freedom-loving people. And so if we just dispose of Saddam Hussein and give them a little bit of support, they'll transform into a country that's going to look like a country in Western Europe or something like that. It'll be an ally and peaceful and a semi-free country. There's not reason to think that like, if there's some kind of opposition party or people in Syria who's actually seem like they want to build something like that, I certainly think the U.S. policy should be to support them. But as we talked about after 9/11, the policy should be that whatever regime comes into power, and we're on the side of any regime that seems that has some small appreciation for freedom and for rule of law, we'll support that. But whatever regime comes in, it should be a non-starter that part of its policy and activities will be to arm and support fighters against Israel and more broadly against the West. That it is, if you harbor any kind of factions like this and to say, well, they're not really part of the government, some wing, they're sort of extra governmental, like Hezbollah in Lebanon or something like that, where it's no, like if you start to go down that road, you're going to be met with real Western opposition. Not that it's going to get to the point, well, maybe you're going to get a nuclear weapon. Our opposition will start immediately, so that whatever they do in the Middle East, these kind of grander aspirations that we're going to bring down Israel and we're going to bring so the little Satan and then the great Satan, it has to be communicated forcefully to them that this is a non-starter. So it's not a fantasy that you're going to have some kind of free society, but you could have regimes that are less threatening to Israel than, say, Iran is. Like, you could have something more like Jordan.
Yeah, I was just thinking the one example that comes to mind is Jordan, and maybe to a lesser degree Egypt, though Egypt is much more problematic in its support of enabling Hamas tunnels and things like that. But Jordan is a good example of where it isn't a savory place. I don't think you choose to live there, but it's certainly not a crusading or jihadist regime. In fact, they regard the jihadists as a threat, and they're really fighting. They're embattled by that force. Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's important to recognize that the removal of Assad is a positive, but the removal of a negative like him does not automatically guarantee that something better will come. That takes effort and thought, and it takes significant judgment on the part of American policymakers to navigate this so that we actually do advance our interests as opposed to surrendering them. And I think I hate to end on this, but it's important that news that I've seen lately is that the kind of message you're talking about is not the message that at least the Biden administration has offered so far to the power that's taken over Syria. And there's talk about recognizing them and trivial token gestures that will be expected of them as steps towards official diplomatic recognition, which I think that's completely in line with past behavior. But this is an opportunity, I would hope, to move in a better direction. So I think anytime a dictator is eliminated from power, it does create an opening. And I think that's the important thing to focus on, is that there's an opportunity here for less bad and sometimes better people to come along. And I think that's where the focus should be on the part of American policymakers.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we should draw a line here. One recommendation is the book that we worked on, Failing to Confront Islamic Totalitarianism, What Went Wrong After 9/11. That's a series of shorter essays on themes connected to Islamists in the Middle East, including the Arab Spring and some of the topics we discussed today. You can find that on Amazon and on our website. I think that's a useful place to start. There's also the book I wrote on Israel and the Palestinian conflict, What Justice Demands. I recommend that for people who want to dive in deeper. And there's an article that I wrote with Yaron Brook a couple of years ago about aspects of what it means to the way people think about dictators and authoritarian leaders in the West, and how there are many misconceptions that need to be skewered. So we'll put that in the show notes for people who want to explore that. And we'll be coming back to this topic in due course. I expect there'll be more developments to talk about. So thank you for joining me today, Onkar.
Thanks.
And see you all next time.